Well, we'll just start with the top one from Christina Longafono. In the transcript of the meeting with Gorbachev and Reagan, it seemed important to all parties that Gorbachev take a clearly subordinate posture to Reagan and Bush and the USSR to the US. Do you think Gorbachev did this because he knew the USSR was on its way out, or because he didn't think the US would let everyone play their ball if he didn't?
It's a great question, Christina. I think Gorbachev is taking a somewhat deferential role there. First of all, because Reagan is leaving and it's a kind of parting meeting. He knows it's the last time they're going to see each other for a while. But also because he knows that Reagan will be better at pushing his successor Bush to do things than he will be. And so he's trying to sort of treat Reagan as the grandfather figure, and Bush and Gorbachev in this sense as the two next generation leaders, and the father telling George HW Bush to move forward. Gorbachev's fear, and it was somewhat realized, was that Bush would not be as willing to move forward with many of the actions that Reagan had undertaken with Gorbachev. Gorbachev believed that Bush was a little more cautious, which he was. And so I think that's what you're seeing. I don't think Gorbachev thought he was on the way out, but I think you're very astute, Christina, to see maybe a faux deference from Gorbachev in that meeting.
Second question from Susan Lowe. Can you talk about declassified presidential documents? How long does it take for them to become declassified? Are there still documents from Reagan's administration that are still classified?
Great question, Susan. So generally it takes 20 to 30, sometimes longer years to get documents declassified. There are often exceptions. I know some of the questions later ask about Iran-Contra, which I didn't talk about. Iran-Contra led to the declassification of certain documents earlier. Some documents are still classified at the Reagan Library. So it's very much about, and this is something that Michael Gillette could talk about in more detail. It's actually a strange part of the US system. If an agency classifies a document, that same agency has to declassify it. So a lot of intelligence documents, defense documents, they take a long time to get declassified. The general rule is 20 to 30 years after we start to get a good number of documents, but there will always be things that will take a lot longer to get access to. For example, the documents on the US coup in Iran in 1953 have only just become available in the last 5 years or so. You can imagine all the security issues surrounding those, but yet we already have some documents from George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So it's very much about who classified the document. It's hard to do original documentary research on an administration within a decade or two of its time being in office.
Right, and Jeremi, I don't know if you know this, but Mike is actually listening in today, so he's out there in the crowd.
So Mike could actually say more about this. He knows, he understands the system inside and out, and would be the best person and instructs me on how to use it.
Next question from Keith Robinson. With the current tensions with China, how is détente viewed today? Should the US go back to economic sanctions and containment of Chinese ambitions?
So it's a great question. I think détente is viewed positively in the US-China relationship, because even the most hawkish anti-Chinese individuals, even someone like John Bolton, doesn't condemn the opening to China in 1972. I mean, I don't really hear anyone say we should go back to the world of the 1960s, where Lyndon Johnson had no connection to China, had no one to talk to there. When he wanted to reach out to the Chinese, he had to do it through Poland, in fact. So détente opened relations between the US and China. At the core of détente was the belief that we should be talking and negotiating with everyone, even our mortal adversaries. This is how Kissinger thought about the world. And I sometimes feel today we're too quick to argue for military action without discussion and negotiation. That said, negotiation doesn't mean you cannot also drive a hard line at the same time. And especially around what appears to be Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and the stealing of intellectual property. I think we should pursue the kind of détente that emphasizes connections and cooperation, but also creating clear rules of the game with incentives and disincentives. The other thing I'll say is that our success in détente in certain periods and in other areas of the world has been because we have built alliances. And what I worry about most today, I think this is embedded in Keith's excellent question, is it's too much about the US and China, not enough about the American Asian Pacific Alliance, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and others. Part of the reason we did well at the end of the Cold War was, I only really emphasized Reagan in this lecture, but he had very strong support and very close alliance with Great Britain, West Germany, the major allies. We need to cultivate those allies in our relationship with China.
Next question from Monica Pahovich. This is something that's come up several times this week. Just the question, are we in another Cold War at this point with Putin?
Well, I think to some extent we are. And this is a great question for why history matters. Because of course, to say that we're in something that looks like another Cold War doesn't mean it's the same as that Cold War. But it does mean that understanding the Cold War helps us understand Vladimir Putin. He is a child of the Cold War. He is a child of the 1960s and 70s. This is a man who comes of age within the KGB. He's stationed for much of his career in Germany, actually in East Germany. And he sees the United States through those eyes. And he believes that Gorbachev was suckered. He has said the greatest calamity of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that explains a lot of his hostility to the United States. I think it's clear that Putin believes that anything that weakens the United States, including internal fighting in the United States, benefits him. Now, I don't think it's a new Cold War because I don't think we're going to have another Cuban Missile Crisis. And I hope we have learned that just because we have another rivalry with Russia today, that doesn't mean we should be intervening all over the world. So I don't think it's another Cold War, but I do think there are Cold War elements, particularly in Vladimir Putin's behavior. He also looks like a Cold War character, doesn't he? He looks and sounds like it. I mean, it really is like Back to the Future with him. Donald Trump is unthinkable in the Cold War, by the way. Someone like Donald Trump, just even, and again, this is something else Mike Gillette knows a lot about, right? The way our parties worked, the way leaders were chosen in the Cold War, there's no way that would have happened. So that's a part of it that's not the Cold War.
Next question from Craig Sanders. Are there comparisons with the Reagan-Gorbachev talks or HW Bush and Gorbachev agreements to later presidential summit meetings, say with Trump and Kim Jong-un, or Trump-Putin, Obama-Putin? Or do you feel those more recent meetings focus more on trade and less on issues facing the US and world near the end of the Cold War?
I think the closest we had to, it's a great question, the closest we had, Craig, to a Cold War style summit recently was when President Obama met with Xi Jinping. I think it was in California, maybe 5, 6 years ago. They had this, maybe 7 years ago, they had this summit in California. And that was very similar from what I've read of that. It was a kind of tour d'horizon where they talked about trade, but they also talked about security issues in Asia. And they were really trying to articulate their different positions and seek out common ground, as I think Reagan and Gorbachev were initially, and as Bush Sr. and Gorbachev were. The meeting with Kim Jong-un is not a Cold War meeting for the very reason that it's not planned and prepared. A number of recent accounts, including John Bolton's memoir, take us into detail at how this doesn't have any of the preparation. It's not a strategic meeting. It's really a kind of bromance, which is not what Cold War summits were. Cold War summits were hyper prepared. In fact, the criticism of them is there was nothing spontaneous, right? You had these teams of strategic specialists who prepared papers, and that's not at all what was happening with Kim and with Trump, or with Obama and Putin, because Putin is notorious for not following the script. One of the things Putin does is he always shows up late. And then he always says something outrageous. He's a bomb thrower in a way that Soviet leaders were not that way. They wanted to do everything by the rules, everything by the book. So I think the closest you get is some of the Obama Xi Jinping meetings. And my guess is that our next president, whenever that happens, and the next Chinese leader will have meetings that will approximate in some ways what we saw during the later Cold War.
Another question from Christina. In Bush's speech announcing the military action to get Iraq out of Kuwait, he makes multiple allusions to the Nazis and positions Saudi Arabia as Iraq's next potential victim. Was this to protect Saudi interests or oil, or genuinely because Saddam had made threats to invade Saudi Arabia next?
Fantastic question. Thank you. And I'm glad you asked that question, because it's another opportunity, Christina, to talk about why history matters for the decision makers. For George H.W. Bush, who came of age during World War II, what Saddam Hussein did in Kuwait looked like Hitler in the Sudetenland or the Japanese in Manchuria. And if you look at his rhetoric, he talks about it as aggression in that way. And he believed that this was another example of a regional power taking advantage of perceived weakness, and that if the United States didn't stand up, they would act aggressively again. And so I think he was legitimately concerned about Saudi Arabia and the larger region. He was also concerned, and Bush had spent a lot of time thinking about the Middle East. He was concerned about this becoming the norm in the Middle East. Quite frankly, he was also concerned about Israeli aggression. He did not want to see this region look like Europe in the 1930s. And so he had a deep concern about that. I think that's what drove him, in the same way that the North Korean attack on South Korea drove Truman, because it also looked like Nazi or Japanese behavior from World War II. The memories we bring as policymakers, and we do this as teachers too, something happens and it reminds us of something, and we act in response to that. Then, in addition to that, yes, as Baker himself said, as Secretary of State Baker said later, oil, of course, was a big part of this. And there was concern that Saddam Hussein would corner the oil market. This is before the fracking revolution, when that oil was absolutely vital. So I think it's the combination of those two things. And I think you see that in Bush's language. His language in that, we'll talk about this when we get to the document, is in some ways World War II language, not Cold War language.
And then Natalie Fontenot had a qualifier to that question. What's the short history of US involvement in Saudi through the Cold War, and how much of US money was invested in Saudi Arabia at this time?
Oh, this is a very tortured history. It's a great question, Natalie. It's a whole workshop unto itself, and it would not be pretty. The US relationship with Saudi Arabia is very, very ugly. From the very beginning, which is to say from the period after World War II, the United States is deeply involved in supporting the monarchy for oil access, initially for our allies, but also to prevent the spread of communism in the regime. As the monarchy becomes very wealthy, it also becomes a source of resources to help American interests in the region. And throughout the 1950s, 60s, and particularly the 70s to the present, the United States provides military aid and cover to Saudi Arabia for some of the worst behavior in the region. It's sometimes behavior that serves our interests, sometimes behavior that doesn't. I'll remind everyone that the majority of the 9/11 attackers came from Saudi Arabia, the largest supporter to this day of madrasas in the region, which produce some of the more extreme elements in the region, are the Saudi leaders. And the Saudi leadership was responsible for assassinating Jamal Khashoggi, who was an immigrant who worked for the Washington Post, assassinated by the Saudi leadership 2 years ago. And we've looked the other way time and again. It's not unique to this dictatorship, but it's particularly galling to me as a historian who's looking for some consistency when we condemn other dictatorships at the same time as we apologize for the Saudis. And it's because of their oil, and it's because of their positioning in the region. And in recent years, it's also been because they've been willing to ally with Israel and other allies of ours in the region. And this is not a criticism of Democrats or Republicans. There's been a consistent problem. Our policy will be a lot better, I think, in the region when we learn from this history that supporting this regime has often done us more harm than good. But it's hard to get out of bad relationships, right? It's hard to get out of bad relationships.
Okay, from Hannah Howard, she's asking about whether you think there's any truth to the idea or rumor that Ronald Reagan's undiagnosed or early onset Alzheimer's contributed to the Iran-Contra scandal, that he was telling the truth, he didn't know about it.
Yeah, I didn't have, it's a great question. I didn't have a chance to get to Iran-Contra because that's also a whole issue unto itself. I've written about it elsewhere. I think actually Reagan should have been impeached for Iran-Contra. There's clear evidence that he knew what was going on, that he authorized at least the basic outlines, and the basic outlines of Iran-Contra were that the United States government was illegally giving military material to Israel. This has not been authorized by Congress. Military material that was then not used by Israel, but given to Iran. Iran paid for it, and that cash was sent to the Contras, who the United States was supporting, who Reagan was supporting in Nicaragua. Congress had passed 2 amendments called the Boland Amendments that explicitly prohibited a penny of American money from going to the Contras. So the violations are threefold: the misuse of American military material. Taxpayers did not build this military, pay for this military material for it to be used this way. Violation of our policy on not giving aid to terrorist regimes. Iran was a terrorist supporting regime. And then the diversion of that money. If any of you did any of those 3 things at your school, you would be fired immediately and put in jail. So Reagan authorized this. The evidence is pretty clear. The independent commission, the Walsh Commission, found this. I've written about it elsewhere. Many others have. Also, he didn't necessarily follow all the details. He knew this was going on. So did George HW Bush, and he lied about that. And I think this is part of a pattern of presidents abusing their power. I think Reagan did it in his mind for the right reasons. He wasn't enriching himself. Let's be clear on this. He didn't get a penny of this. He wasn't running hotels that benefited from this, but he was still breaking the law. In the same way, if you did this at your school, you'd be breaking the law. His Alzheimer's, though, does matter because in two ways. One that's general. We do see in the documents, and many comment on this, including George Shultz, as Secretary of State, that by 87, 88, he was slowing down. He was forgetting a lot of things. Whether it was Alzheimer's or old age or whatever, he was slowing down. This is a real issue we have to think about. Age matters. Age matters. We especially, my wife says, we as men like to deny that it has any effect on us, but it matters. And it definitely matters for Iran-Contra, because one of the reasons that independent counsel Lawrence Walsh, who by the way was a Republican, who led the independent investigation, who uncovered much of the evidence in 1987, early 88, one of the reasons Walsh did not go for impeachment against Reagan was because they didn't want to have to put the president through that. He felt that Reagan appeared to be in physical decline, and they didn't want that to be at the center of the story. And he says this in his memoir, and he was, by the way, a Reagan voter initially, that they were just going to wait for his term to run out. And so I think it mattered.
From Stuart Carter, it seems from the memo of the meeting that Reagan and Gorbachev had a warmer relationship than what the president-elect Bush would have. Bush was head of the CIA for a little bit in the 1970s. So his question is, could that experience in the CIA have made Bush more skeptical of Soviet motives?
Absolutely, Stuart. Absolutely right. The skepticism I articulated from Robert Gates, who I have deep respect for, that lasted till 1988, that was pervasive in the CIA, and for good reason. They had professional reasons to be skeptical. The CIA analysts, who were very good analysts, they were trained to examine the Soviet threat to the US. They were trained to see the long-term reasons why the Soviet Union was a threat to the US, and they were very skeptical that any one person could change that. And in a certain way, they were correct, because they didn't believe someone trying to do what Gorbachev could do could survive in the Soviet system. They just didn't anticipate that the system would collapse that quickly, or that it would then go through the second stage right now. So I do think George HW Bush's experience in the CIA gave him good reason to be a little more cautious. He invested less in the individual and invested more in the system. And second, he was just a cautious person by nature. He was just a cautious person by nature. One of the things that makes him endearing to us now is this is a man who ran a very, very competent White House. He wanted experts around him who gave him information. He wanted serious deliberation, and then he wanted to make the best decision he could make. And that's why many would say Brent Scowcroft and Jim Baker were the best team any president has had in recent memory, because that's what they did. That's what they did. You would want to run your school the way Bush ran the White House. You probably wouldn't want to run your school the way Reagan ran the White House.
Great. So next we have this question of statues and political statues, comparing the tearing down of statues in Berlin to what's happening today, and your opinions on that, what those comparisons look like.
Right. And of course, anytime one makes a comparison, I appreciate the concerns the questioner has, because anytime one makes and I would say the person, I don't know who the person's name is, I apologize. I like to refer to people by their first name, it's more polite. Anytime you make a comparison, there always are differences. And I'm not saying in any way that everything or most things are the same. And I'm certainly not saying that the students who bravely crossed the Berlin Wall are the same as the young people who are tearing down Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee statues or Stonewall Jackson statues today. But here's what I'm saying, and I think we do have to take this seriously. There are many things in our society, and as there were during the Cold War, that are markers of power. And those markers of power reinforce power for certain people. If you want to change the power structure, often taking those things down is really important. We talked about this actually on my podcast yesterday with Richard Reddick, who studies this as an educational theorist and scholar. And there's definite evidence that when you bring African-American kids on a campus with all kinds of Confederate statues, it has an effect on them, makes them feel less at home. In the same way, I as a Jew will have trouble feeling at home, right? If you send me to a place that's named after anti-Semites, right? I don't feel comfortable in things named after Henry Ford, okay? I can separate a Ford car from that, but if you say it's the Henry Ford building, I'm thinking about his anti-Semitism, I'm sorry to say, right? And so the point here is that the Berlin Wall was an expression of communist Soviet power in another country. And these statues are expressions of certain power, Confederate statues in particular. And they have that effect. Taking them down, like taking down the Berlin Wall, is an empowering moment for certain groups. Now, you can support that or be against that. You can certainly criticize the way they do it. But there's no doubt that that is part of what's going on. And we as historians should be willing to talk about that. And that's why names matter. That's why statues matter. That's why these things are so important. I don't think this is just political extremism. I think this is very serious for who we are as a society and where we should be contributing as historians. But I in no way mean to disrespect other points of view. I just want us to have a conversation about it, and I'm open to that conversation, by the way.
Thank you. And this is the last question you marked Answer Live. We're coming up on 20 minutes of Q&A, so I think this will be the last one before we turn to the document discussions. But from Thomas Longbotham, what events signified the end of the Cold War, or was it a set of conditions? What were the defining characteristics of the Cold War ending?
That is such a great DBQ question, isn't it? Right? I mean, that's just perfect, and it's at the center of the philosophy of history, right? When do we know things have changed? Right? We study change, but when do we know? It's always clearer in retrospect, right? But when do we know that things have changed? So I think it's always about the conditions, Thomas. It's always a broader set of phenomena, but then there are moments that encapsulate that, and so I think that it is the broader shift that's going on in the United States, the Soviet Union, and the international system. Many of the things I talked about, changing memories of World War II, changing definitions of power, different generations of citizens, different aspirations, a rejection of the misuse of military power, all these sorts of things, a rejection of communism, the failures of the communist system that are evident to everyone. Those are the broader conditions. But then I think the events that we talked about, particularly the '88 visit of Gorbachev to New York, and then the coming down to the Berlin Wall, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, those two moments, I think they encapsulate those changes. And those changes are happening around them. Those are the moments where individual leaders and actors seize on those changes, right? They seize on them. And that's what makes that moment so important. But those moments wouldn't mean anything without that context. And that's what's significant. I always think about history in the way, this sounds too heady, right? But in the way Bismarck talks about it, which Henry Kissinger later on takes, which is to say that the individuals don't make history. Individuals are sort of, we're sailing in the sea. The current is what moves us, but we can choose to try to adjust and navigate to that current. And leaders are actually, the effective leaders are effective navigators in a current that they don't create.
Great. Okay, that gets us through our Q&A questions. I do want to say there was someone who had commented a link to an SNL skit about Reagan and Gorbachev or something. So maybe share that in the chat and we can make sure to disseminate that to everyone.
Is that the one where Reagan is the closet genius and he's like speaking all the languages? Like he has the people come in and
I don't know, we'll find out.